Welcome to the debate. Let's dive in. Today's topic is about the fundamental clash and how we should govern generative AI. I mean, we're not talking about, a basic app anymore. Gen AI is now this massive industrial scale engine. It's producing language, code, even influencing our social reality at just an unprecedented speed. It makes the question of governance absolutely critical. And the core conflict, well, that's a classic one in regulating technology, isn't it? Do you favor the precautionary principle, that strict, ex-ante kind of red light approach, like how you treat a new pharmaceutical? Or do you commit to permissionless innovation, which is more the green light philosophy, favoring rapid experimentation and, fixing problems ex post after they happened? I'm firmly in the camp that innovation, it has to be prioritized through a market-driven approach.
Okay, I see why you'd think that, but let me offer a different perspective here. That green light philosophy, that whole idea of we'll fix it later, I just think that's a luxury we can no longer afford. My position is that strict ex-ante regulation, meaning rules that are set before this technology is widely launched, is absolutely essential. And that's because the risks we're facing here, they seem systemic, potentially irreversible, and frankly, could be catastrophic. This isn't just some simple software bug you can patch next week.
That's an interesting point, though. I guess I'd frame it differently. Look, innovation is, I think, inherently beneficial. It drives progress, creates economic value, solves real-world problems. If you impose heavy, sort of suffocating regulation right at the outset, you're simply going to kill that progress. Regulators really have to resist what feels like a moral panic sometimes. The smart approach, I believe, is the green light. You let the technology run its course, and you only craft very targeted solutions for specific problems if and when they actually materialize. And let me add one more really crucial point here. Heavy, horizontal regulation, especially the kind that involves expensive compliance mechanisms, it creates a dangerous regulatory moat. Only the really big tech incumbents, the companies whose CEOs are actually asking for regulation, ironically enough, they're the only ones who can really afford those huge compliance costs. This effectively crushes competition from the vibrant startup world and the open source community too, basically cementing an oligopoly.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the primary concern here should be economic competition. Not in this arena. My core belief is that the risks GNA poses, they touch fundamentally on security and, importantly, human dignity. This technology creates what some sociologists call manufactured risks. You can think of them as these large-scale systemic threats, kind of like climate change, that society basically creates itself. The real danger is that they are potentially irreversible once they're released into the wild. So the wait-and-see approach, it fails spectacularly here because we are squarely in what's known as the Collingridge dilemma. This dilemma basically states that when a powerful technology is new, you don't actually know enough to regulate it effectively.
But by the time the systemic harm becomes undeniable, whether that's automated discrimination in hiring, let's say, or maybe dual-use misuse for developing bioweapons, the technology will be so deeply entrenched, so powerful, that it becomes almost impossible to change its course. Therefore, implementing strict ex-ante controls, maybe like the risk classification approach they're using in the EU AI Act, seems like the only truly rational way to protect society now before it's too late.
Okay, let's stick with that regulatory moat point just for a moment. You kind of dismiss it as just an economic issue, but I think it impacts public access and safety as well. If you implement these incredibly expensive, complex licensing and auditing regimes for the foundation models, the really big AI systems, you are, in effect, giving the big tech cartel a massive, massive advantage. Your smaller competitors, little tech, the open source scripts, they simply lack the billions, literally billions of dollars in capital needed for that kind of compliance. So why should government policy end up cementing an oligopoly? You seem to be trading market dynamism for bureaucratic control.
That argument, frankly, it feels like it prioritizes market structure way above public safety. And I find that, morally insufficient given what's at stake here. I agree the moat is a problem, sure, but it's a symptom. It's not the primary disease. The primary disease is that we are automating and scaling manufactured risk at an unprecedented level. When an opaque algorithm automatically applies bias in lending, for instance, or maybe in criminal justice assessments, and it does so at the scale of millions, maybe billions of decisions a minute, that is not just some commercial imperfection. That is a systemic violation of fundamental rights. It demands, I think, non-negotiable standards before that technology is allowed to automate discrimination right across society. You simply cannot sue your way out of systemic bias once the algorithm is embedded everywhere.
Okay, fine. If we're going to be serious about regulating systemic risk, then we need to choose the right regulatory model, don't we? The type of regulation you need, it seems to depend entirely on the analogy you use. Now, proponents of your safety first view, they often gravitate toward the FDA analogy, treating those powerful frontier models like pharmaceuticals, right? Requiring licensing, mandatory pre-release capability evaluations, extensive red teaming to prove safety and efficacy before market release. If a system can potentially design, say, a new pathogen, it absolutely needs a license before it gets released. Wouldn't you agree? Precisely, yes. For the highest capability, the most powerful models, the FDA model does make a lot of sense. You need some kind of structured, almost like clinical trials for AI safety. The US executive order even calls for extensive red teaming and safety evaluations before these powerful models are launched. The whole idea is that the public shouldn't be the unwitting guinea pig here.
I'm still not quite convinced by that line of reasoning. Because practically speaking, how do you actually conduct a clinical trial for a foundation model that's being retrained and updated maybe every week or even daily? Isn't that just administratively impossible? A drug formula is stable, it's deterministic. AI models are inherently non-deterministic. They're constantly evolving, and they are just rife with deep ambiguities. You run into Knightian uncertainty, those infamous unknown unknowns where you can't even quantify the probability of certain risks materializing. If you try to test for all of those potential unknowns ex ante, you risk paralyzing the entire industry. I think the better analogy, the more pragmatic one perhaps, is the aviation or traffic safety analogy. Look, we don't ban cars because they sometimes crash. We regulate the environment they operate in and the deployer, the driver, not the core engine itself.
You should require rigorous red teaming. Think of them as the crash tests, and maybe driver's licenses or some kind of certification, but only for high-risk applications like medical diagnosis systems or things controlling critical infrastructure. But you leave the core technology, the engine itself, largely free for use in low-risk domains, like writing poetry or drafting emails.
I appreciate the aviation analogy as maybe a hybrid approach, but I think that traffic safety model, well, it really only works effectively at the application layer, the final output layer. We need to go deeper into the stack, I believe, because the core engine, that's where the systemic data extraction and the biases really originate.
That's exactly right. And if the engine itself is too complex, too dynamic, to regulate directly, then we need pragmatic, flexible solutions at the output layer. Technical standards like C2PA, the Content Provenance and Authenticity Standard, I think they'll solve a lot of the immediate problems like deepfakes and misinformation. C2PA essentially acts like a cryptographic watermark or maybe a digital nutrition label that cryptographically proves where a piece of content came from. We need Lessig's concept that code is law to actually work for transparency. Let's build transparency mechanisms directly into the technology itself, rather than relying on slow, bureaucratic legal interventions to try and catch up later.
Okay, I agree that code as law is probably the most powerful lever we have, but the current code architecture, let's be honest, it largely serves surveillance capitalism, not the public interest. The industry default design is basically maximum data extraction, and this fuels what some people are calling the second enclosure movement, where the digital commons, all that public data, creative work online, Wikipedia, everything is being sucked into private corporate models purely for profit. We're literally witnessing the largest data grab in history, and the fair use fights, like the big one involving the New York Times suing OpenAI, they just prove that courts are way too slow and uncertain when dealing with this kind of scale of data extraction. So the real solution, I would argue therefore, is forcing architectural change, like mandating privacy by design principles, perhaps using decentralized methods like federated learning where the data stays local.
Or maybe you create collective licensing infrastructure, something similar to how the UK's CLA model manages rights for published works. So creators are actually compensated fairly for the data extraction that generates all the economic value in the first place.
You need to regulate the input and the architecture, you see, not just tinker with the output.
Shifting gears a bit, the whole geopolitical angle adds another really complex layer to this debate. When you look at the major governance models emerging globally, the U.S. sectoral approach, often guided by the NIST AI RMF, which, let's remember, is just a voluntary framework for managing AI risk. It clearly prioritizes competitive advantage through speed. I tend to think the most effective way for the U.S. to manage risk and maintain its leadership is to focus strategically on compute choke points. Things like imposing export controls on the most advanced chips that fuel AI development, preventing rivals from gaining military capability, rather than strangling our own domestic innovation with overly burdensome bureaucratic hurdles.
Well, focusing on the silicon schism, the chip controls, is obviously necessary for national security. I grant you that. But this global fragmentation, you've got the EU's rights-based AI Act, the US's more market-driven framework, and China's state-controlled approach, this fragmentation really forces the Global South into a terrible bind. They risk becoming victims of a new kind of technological colonialism. They provide the raw data, often scraped without fair compensation, that trains these massive models only to have to buy back the high-value proprietary models built primarily in the global north. This situation, it demands a much stronger focus on things like model sovereignty, developing local LLMs, say, specific to languages like Indonesian or Swahili, models that actually reflect local culture and values, or perhaps aggressively leveraging open source models to try and break the dominance of these few centralized powers, rather than just exporting our Western regulatory models wholesale. You can't just focus narrowly on the US-China tech race. You have to consider the broader, long-term global impact. Okay, I concede that the consequences in the Global South are potentially dire, and the whole issue of technological colonialism and data extraction, yes, it absolutely must be addressed, perhaps through means beyond just Western regulation alone.
Thank you. Ultimately, this isn't really just a technical debate about algorithms, is it? It's fundamentally a trade-off about core societal values.
And I agree it's a trade-off. You absolutely have to acknowledge the risks, but policy needs to be adaptive, flexible, and avoid paralyzing innovation. For me, the optimal path forward is probably a layered approach. Set some universal, minimal transparency guardrails, like that C2PA standard we talked about, but then regulate the use much more strictly, but only in specific, high-risk application sectors, really embracing that aviation model. That allows a machine to run freely where the risk is genuinely low, ensuring we still get the benefits, the prosperity.
My core concern, though, remains that we absolutely must reject this false binary of either a total ban or a complete free-for-all. Policy has to carefully negotiate those three critical axes of value: human dignity, prosperity, and security. The necessary hybrid model, I think, must be hard where the systemic risk is highest, things like licensing frontier model safety, auditing high-risk applications rigorously, and then maybe flexible elsewhere. Innovation needs to be meaningful, aligned with democratic values, not simply chasing maximum market speed at any cost.
I think we both agree, fundamentally, that we are dealing with a kind of duality here. This technology is simultaneously like a powerful printing press with the potential for widespread good, but it also has these hidden, systemic capabilities, perhaps more akin to a nuclear reactor. The real fundamental challenge is figuring out the precise technical and legal boundaries between those two realities.
It certainly is a profound challenge.
And that's our chat on the debate. Thanks for listening. See you in the next one.